Well, I'm Chris Bowles. I work at UT Austin, and we have a fair to middling-sized Puppet enterprise infrastructure, about 500 nodes. And so I was going to talk to you today about how we try to get Puppet for everybody, so that everybody can use Puppet in a federated way and in a hierarchical way, using node groups and Puppet enterprise. So first off, sorry, I gotta go through my notes and make sure I said everything. Actually, I'll stop real quick. So, two highlights of the way that we use Puppet are that we use Puppet as a tool, as something that you can plug into as a user without necessarily having to know Puppet code, which is really useful, right? So Puppet is a great thing to use without having to necessarily know about resources or classes or anything that makes any of the kind of the inner parts of Puppet. And so that's one aspect. But we also have, we want to enable Puppet as a platform. And so that's Puppet as the way that you usually think of Puppet, right? You're writing classes, you're extending Puppet, more complex uses of Puppet. And so that's, and so our goal here, and I made some notes based on Byron's presentation, is to enable you to not have to repeat yourself, enable the drive principle. So, all right, Puppet for everybody. Yes, we want Puppet Enterprise to be used by development, by operations, by management, so that it acts as a full-fledged DevOps toolchain. And it's actually a really good tool for that. And because configuration management, as we've seen, is not just for sysadmins. Right, it's for everybody has a vested interest in getting their nodes configured correctly. And so our, wow, can you guys see that arrow at all? Those are just floating out there, aren't they? So there should be an arrow pointing up and to the right. Here, like this. So we start at the bottom. We start at the novice layer, and that's the Puppet as a tool perspective, is that you should be able to log into the console and immediately set classes, variables, parameters, and get your work done, and see your kind of primitives in Puppet. Then moving on from that, and the way that we look at variables at the novice layer is that the variables are kind of simple variables, right? And just to hedge here a little bit, we use 3.3.2, we haven't moved to 3.7. So all these will kind of be based on the older console, and all the screenshots are old. So there is the newer ones. 3.7 is similar, but it's a little bit different in some aspects. So the medium layer, that's where, and so the novice layer requires only that you get into the console, no code whatsoever if you don't want to. At the medium level, once you've gotten a little more expertise, or if you need to put things in hierarchy, you put things in hierarchy, right? The back-end data store. And that's for more, and I'll talk about this more later, but that's for more complicated data structures. That's for arrays, hashes, anything that you really can't put into an ENC variable or in a console variable. And then finally you have the expert level. And so again, these were Puppet as a tool, right? You don't have to write Puppet code. You don't really have to know that much about Puppet, honestly. You got to know how to use the website and to write a YAML file or any of the other backends that Byron mentioned. But finally you have the expert level. And we want to allow people, if they want to, write their own Puppet code, write custom facts, custom functions, any of the other stuff you could do as a Puppet user in a more complicated use case. And we wanted to enable all of these people to use Puppet. And so that's kind of our goal. So our UT Puppet canon, which we don't actually say, I just made it up for the slide deck. But hopefully, I think it does capture what we're looking to do, is that we're looking for Puppet at UT to be inclusive, right? That everybody should be able to use Puppet, not just the administrators, not even just the developers, right? Not even just the operators, but developers, management, anybody who has a dog in that fight. That it's secure by default, which basically is that we push out base configurations that are secure, SSH, firewall, all the usual things. And that we make sure that no matter what else you do, you get that secure configuration. And then lastly, that it's federated, that you can successfully pull configurations, YAML data, code from disparate sources, and they're pulled together into a centralized repository. kind of like the states. So we build this off of Puppet Enterprise. That's that upside down blue triangle in the middle. And then to make our UT Puppet work, we bolt on 3 different things. The first of which is at the top, and that's our UT Puppet community. And I don't have a lot of slides on that, but it actually is the most important thing of all of the 3, because without the people, it doesn't work. So that's why we have an awesome Puppet group, plug, which is awesome. We have our own internal UT Puppet group, which is growing, but it really is critical that people can share thoughts, ideas, code review as a big part of this. But that you have best practices for your group as well as, which hopefully is based upon Puppet's own best practices. So that's why it's on the top. And also I needed to fill in 3 spots. So secondly is nested configs. That's on the bottom left. And that's kind of the heart of this presentation. And this presentation is about why we do it, but it's also a lot of it's about how we do it. So if you're interested in doing it, you can kind of use this as a way to do it. And I'll get more into that later. I'll break each of these out. And the last is code and data federation. And that's, again, that's so you can pull your Puppet code from a lot of different sources, and you can pull your data from a lot of different sources in terms of hierarchy generally. So, I'll use my mad PowerPoint skills. So the top one is, so I pulled out a UT Puppet community, so we'll talk about people for a while. So again, UT Puppet culture is something we're trying to build. You know, we're trying to, we do have developers at UT, none of them use Puppet. They use Java and other things like that I don't really know much about. But we're trying to tie into that software development lifecycle. Module coding standards, and there's excellent coding standards that Puppet produces, and that we're starting to kind of converge on, some of which were touched on earlier. Also, documentation standards. Hasn't been mentioned, I don't believe, during this, but there are some really good tips and tricks for how to document your modules and your classes that allow people to see what they're supposed to do, what their requirements are, and that's all part of it. And finally, is that to empower people, right? To allow those people to make it to where people can update code, can review your code, can suggest new things, and not just suggest them, but actually give them to you via a pull request or some other form of code update. And also so that people can change the things that they should change, and they can't change the things that they can't change. And so kind of encapsulation, role-based ACLs, basically, which are really good in 3.7. So this is our, can you guys see that okay in the back? So this is our UT Puppet diagram. And basically, you see that the novice is going to go directly to the Puppet console. There you can modify classes, console groups, and you can update variables. And I will make a note here that we have a bit of an unusual use case for Puppet Enterprise, is that we have node groups apply classes and they apply top-level ENC variables. And that is how we basically parameterize our classes, which was based on the fact that you couldn't, we have a hierarchy of node groups, which I'll get into later, and there wasn't a way to parameterize at a high level and then re-parameterize at a lower level. That's why we do that. So in 3.7, you actually can do that, and so we're going to be changing our standards, but just FYI, that's why we make very heavy use of variables. And then finally, you get a configured server. So a novice can plug into the existing infrastructure, update, let's say, SSH port to 22, from 22 to 1100, and it works, and that's it. And they can do that at whatever level is useful, and that they're allowed to do. And then once you get it to an expert can update hierarchical, and can also write module code, which is useful, so you can add new stuff. And of course, the class and the module code is still key to getting things done in Puppet, as we've seen. So that's all for people, but it is really important. So nested configs is the next part, and here's my funny picture. So we nest everything in the console. We nest groups, and we nest variables, and we can also kind of nest hierarchy, which I'll get to later, which is just directory structure. So the metaphor I use is think of a minifigure. So that you can think of the base configuration, as we saw in the excellent roles and profile talk, is that you get you can get a torso, right? And then you can configure that torso to add you can configure the color of the cowl. You can make it any color you want. You can add the cape, and then you can use the kind of the role and profile pattern to add different heads and arms and cape. But it can be based on a good standard build. And so here's and we'll talk about the console nesting here, which is highlighted. And so the general idea is that of like Russian nesting dolls. That's pretty much the way that we think of it. And so here's a picture of how we have our stuff configured. At the base level, that we have base, right? That's all your defaults, right? And that is itself kind of a profile if you think of the role profile pattern, but it encapsulates everything else. So it's like that is the great-great-great-grandparent of every other node group. And then right below that, and these are basically hierarchies, right? So this is the base hierarchy. And then you have the profile hierarchy, in this case an Apache. And that's a child of the base node group. And then below that, and then profile is basically, with base being your OS, base level OS configurations, profile is everything that makes you an Apache server. So it works exactly like role and profile does in code, except it's done in the console. And then you have your role, which inherits the OS level and the Apache configurations, but it adds on whatever makes a wiki server special. And that could be could be a class, could be a role and profile class, or it could just be a configuration or a variable. And then you attach the wiki to one and only one role node group. And then from wiki, it inherits Apache, and from Apache, it inherits base. And so wiki gets the combination of all three layers without having to write any public code. And with being able to change those layers at whatever layer is appropriate in the node, in the public console, which is handy. And so here's that, if you kind of imagine taking that and then turning it on its side, that's what that looks like. And so you have and this is the way it pretty much works out in the public console, is that you have at the top layer, you have your base, which are your security defaults. Profiles are children of base. All the roles are children of a specific profile. And then nodes are always attached to one and only one node group, as well as default and collective, but we kind of leave those out of our tree. And so the nice thing here is that, let's say you started out with this simple base Apache wiki, and then you had your wikis. But then you added a blog role. And so all you have to do is add role blog, just create a node group, and it's going to inherit all of this. And then all you have to do is change what's different about blogs, as opposed to the standard Apache build. And then you attach the nodes, and you're off to the races. And and then you can have blog 01 and 02, but you could have blog 03, 05, as many as you need, depending on your code, depending on how you set up hierarchy, etc. But theoretically, and in a very real way actually, this highlighted area is your business logic, right? And this is where you're going to put what is it at the business layer that makes that server special. And anything else that you can get automatically or via fact, you can put into your code. Oh, and another useful use case is that this is an excellent way. We actually, at our work, we have this set up slightly differently. But you can actually set, let's say you have a role blog, but you could actually break up an additional hierarchy, which is like environment. So if you want to create a test environment, then you could have blog _ test, and as an additional hierarchical layer, put that under, and then that test, you change one thing, and it's an exact copy of your production except for that one thing. Which is handy. We use that quite a bit. And so, just to reiterate, from the nodes point of view, wikis is containing classes and variables from base, from profile Apache, and from role wiki, without having to explicitly put into any of those, which is nice. And just a quick note, based on Puppet, this is a little bit of an off-brand use of the Puppet console. And full disclosure here, I have an ulterior motive. I would like as many of you to use it this way, so that Puppet Labs will kind of support this use case, more fully, which would be awesome. But right now, Puppet doesn't really display things in a tree version, and like you don't really get it in like an OU look, which is essentially what we're creating. And so what we do is we namespace these. It's very similar to how you do roles and profile, actually. And so that the base is the base, and so the base can be called whatever you want. It's kind of freestanding. But then anything at the profile level has a prefix of profile, which just kind of tells you where it is, basically. And similarly, role has a prefix of role. Now I use profile and role very generically, and I use these very simply. This is just kind of a template. We use departments and service as the way that we break these out. But the general idea is that you can create these in any way that's useful to you, which is and so that's kind of a handy way of building a hierarchy using names and using parent-child inheritance. And so I'll show this in action using my Lego analogy. So this is a screenshot of a 3.32, but it basically holds in 3.7. And so this is the base group. And so the base group has, I guess I have my pointer here. And so on the base group, you see that it has a class, SSH, and that I have a variable called SSH underscore port. Now, that's set to 22, since that's just kind of the standard default. And then Profile Apache, which if you recall is directly a child of base, it's inheriting SSH port 22 from base, and it's inheriting the class, but it's also adding HTTP port 80 and the Apache class. And in 3.3.2, it actually shows the source. It wouldn't show that necessarily in 3.7, but I've actually recommended that as an enhancement. I think that's actually a useful thing to see. But so you can see where your node group is inheriting from above, and it's setting something new. So we go down to the role, which is the third, right? So this is the role is the child of the profile, and it's the grandchild of the base. And so this is very similar to how you do this in code. And I know it's small, but it's basically inheriting everything from above, and it's also, but the difference is, there's no difference in class. It's inheriting the same exact classes, but it's changing the port to 88. And it's also adding, and I probably should put these in different colors, and it's adding a new HTTP source, like location. So the useful thing about this is not only is it inheriting a variable, but it's also overriding it to a different value, which is in the service environment use case is exactly the same thing you do. You might say, I want to have a wiki service, but I want to have the wiki test environment, and so I inherit everything from my service wiki, and then I just change my port to something else, so I can test it out. And so finally, your node in both versions of Puppet actually is the kind of resultant set of policy, right? Everything applies at the node level. And so you can see all the things that we've applied have stacked together into the node. The HTTP port, which is coming from role wiki, the new source, and the SSH port has remained unchanged. So that's just been inherited downwards. And you can see that SSH port is kind of a stand-in for any standard OS level configuration. We have a ton, but just to be simple, I just did SSH port. But that could be anything. And that also allows you to very easily change things very broadly, or really at any layer. So if you need to change something for every single OS setting or add something new, you add it to the base group and it gets it. If you need to change something for the Apache, you change that one node group and it gets it without having to update any public code. And so just to break down and to refresh a little bit. So all the nodes are getting everything from their groups. And the groups are attaching variables and classes. And just to clarify again, usually in a lot of cases you would say you would actually take the class and then directly parameterize that class. We're just a little odd because we couldn't do that in 3.3.2, but in 3.7 you can't do that, and I'd recommend that. And so things inherit different ways. So when you talk about inheriting from a grandfather, or let's say a parent node to a child node, is that class inheritance is immutable, which means it doesn't change, which is really, really handy actually. Is because what that means is you can for base, you can assign things that you want to make sure that they get set. Let's say you want to say, I want to make sure you have SSH and you have firewall, and I don't want you to remove those. And if you assign that class, that's exactly what happens. So in this case, base assigns SSH at the top. Profile Apache can add to its kind of class payload. And so you see where RollWiki inherits SSH and Apache, and then Node similarly just inherits both of those, but they can't be taken away, which is really useful from my perspective because I'm in the core group, in the core kind of IT group, and so I want to make sure that when I hand off these to other sysadmins downstream of me, either service admins, that they're getting all the things that we want them to get. Now the nice thing is that SSH can be parameterized or variabilized in any way that we allow it to be done via the code, right? So I can say you can add, so let's say RollWiki or Profile Apache or even the node, you can update SSH if it accepts a port variable. You can change the port, right? You can change the port from 22 to something else, but only something else that the class itself will accept, which in our case would be a number. So you can't just set it to foo or a letter. Variable inheritance is a little bit different. The child wins, and so it's kind of immutable, I guess. But whatever that variable is set to, closest to the node itself will win. And so at the base, let's say you have nothing set at the base, and you set that HTTP port. Logs, it never resets it, so it just inherits that 80. And for Wiki, it resets it to 8080, and so it stays reset. So it's handy. So putting everything together, here's kind of the annotated version of Wiki 1. And here's the overrides, here's the immutable inclusions, and here's the entire list of groups. And this does look a little bit different in 3.7, but it functionally works the same. Okay. So that's it for the console. And so now we're going to talk about Hiera. And so Hiera, just as a refresher, is for us is primarily used for complex variables. By no means it's the only choice. I mean, you can use it for anything you want. And actually, as a plug for 3.7, you actually can do arrays and hashes in Puppet Enterprise 3.7. You just have to wrap them in JSON. But generally speaking, we use Hiera for arrays, which is a list of things, and for hashes, which is a key value, a list of key value pairs. When you think of Hiera, think of back-end data mapping, basically. And so we actually nest our Hiera in a very similar way in a very similar manner to the way that we nest our Puppet console groups. It breaks down exactly the same. You have your base, you have your profile level, your role, and eventually your node. But the way that it works is that each layer is a directory, the way that we kind of break it out on the Puppet master. And so anything that is a Hiera for the base layer is just in the root of that Hiera data path. And I'll actually show you the YAML configuration, Hiera configuration. Then the next directory is the profile directory. And it's just named basically the same as Apache. And the magic to that is that we actually set an ENC variable in the profile Apache that connects it to that directory. So you say profile equals Apache, and so that, and then the role, you say role equals wiki. And so once you get down to the node layer, since the node's actually what's running against the Puppet server, it says, I have a variable called profile equals Apache, and I have a variable called role equals wiki. And so that allows the Puppet server to construct this, this location. And so it gives you a kind of a unique place to put Hiera for that directory, for that particular server, which is pretty cool. And here's a few more slides kind of explaining how that works. And so it goes from, if you look from the top down, it's broad to more specific. And so anything in the base is going to be, this directory will be queried if there's no variable set, right? Or it will always be queried since those are base. This particular directory will be hit if that profile is set. So any YAML configured for Apache it'll query the /Apache directory. And then similarly for wikis, if role is equal wiki, then profile is equal to Apache, and then it'll look in that directory, which is handy. And so this is actually the hire.yaml. If you guys have seen this in Puppet Enterprise, and so this is the YAML data directory, right? Etsy Puppet Labs Puppet Hire. That's the root, right? And then I guess the point I'm making here is that the hierarchy is broad here to more specific as you traverse the tree. And then in the hire YAML, it does a priority lookup. And so the first thing is actually, that is the most specific thing. So you have to kind of flip it. And so this is the actual hierarchy. And the nice thing about hire is that it actually allows you to construct your own hierarchy. The one I just showed to you is based on this YAML configuration, but you can actually construct it any way you want. In fact, our real one is much longer than this. But what it will do is that hire, when it does a lookup, will look through these directories. First, we'll look in profile, role, common, right? And that actually translates to profile, role, common.yaml, which I'll show you later. And then profile, common, and then common. And then so you can actually set for each role, you can set its own unique YAML configurations. For each profile, it gets its own configurations. And then you can actually have configurations that apply to everybody. So, to put it together. This is everything kind of put together in an eggshell, I guess. And so the mapping here, you see the base to the root, the profile Apache to /Apache, and then the role wiki to Apache wiki. And then when the wiki node talks to the server, it looks for Apache wiki common.yaml, because it always adds on the YAML, and then Apache common.yaml. And it just allows you to basically separate your hire out into multiple areas. Why would you want to do that? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. And the advanced hire usage is kind of a bonus slide, I guess. If you really want to, by default, like I said, hire does a priority lookup, right? It's going to find the key you look up, and hire is always a key value lookup, and the most specific one will win. But if you want to, and we don't make a real heavy use of this, you can have hire create a hash or an array out of multiple layers in your hierarchy. I think Byron mentioned that, which is perfect for if the hire data you have is exactly what you need, except for like one thing. You need an additive thing. We used to use it for firewall. Suitors might be a good use, but I just throw it out there. It's good to keep in your toolkit. So lastly is code and data separation. And this is the major reason why we separate hire out the way that we do. So I'll get into that. So on the code side, we, like I said, we have a lot of different people using Puppet. Our Puppet server pulls code from a lot of different places. And that's to allow people to kind of safely edit their own configurations. So as a kind of an example here, we have a base source, which is in our case an SVN repository. And then for the kind of hypothetical profile for Apache, for the web team, they have their own source. And then for the wiki folks who are kind of downstream of Apache but have their own code, they have their own source. And all that's funneled into the Puppet server using from a SVN repository using VCS repo, which I don't recommend if you haven't already done that. Like changes are on the way though. And so, like I said here, this is basically how we do this. And this is non-standard, and it was set up before I knew about R10K. But basically, I just have a module path on the Puppet server that is a mile long and has all these individual subversion checkouts that VCS repo self-monitors, which is awesome. And it doesn't at all take my Puppet server forever to run. But it's useful. It actually works pretty well in that it separates their code. And then so I can put my code in a particular place in the server that's tied to a place that I control. And likewise, the folks the service owners and the service environment owners can be added can have their own kind of places to put code. So they don't have to go through me, and they don't have to go directly on my server, which is all to the good. And I'll talk a little bit about it. We're planning on doing R10K or code something. That I want to find out about that new thing in the future. And data works the same way. And actually, this is the payoff for separating the hierarchy the way that we did. Is that we can also federate. So not only do we do our code, which is cool, but it just puts it into a long kind of search path. But we can do the same thing for data. And so my base repo can put things into root. So I can put common YAML, any other common things I need to put in. But then I can do VCS repo checkouts for the Apache folks into their own directory, which is handy. So they can actually manage their code and their hierarchy in their own repo. It gets checked out, and away they go. They're good. And then same thing with the wiki people. And then so what I needed, the reason I did that was because I needed a unique directory to check out. And that's what I get with this setup, allowing you to kind of break out hierarchy. Because in a lot of cases, we did not want people editing hierarchy data, other people's hierarchy files, because they're YAML files and they're delicate. And so I really want this, by the way. I think my son wants this. That's awesome. So what's in our future? Well, there's a few things that I have slides for, and there's a few things that I'll just extemporaneously talk about, I guess, since I was too lazy to make more slides. So right now, like I said, we have these massive monolithic SVN checkouts via VCS repo. That works, but if you have to update the whole thing, it's a little bit. VCS repo uses SVN update, it's a little bit kludgy. So we're gonna move to a Git flow using R10K. And the nice thing about that is that you can get the best practice is to have a single Git repo per module, which allows you to make it much more modular, much more granular. You can use Git branches to actually match the head of your production branch. You can create new branches very cheaply and easily. Ideally, you can let people, if somebody has an improvement, you say, all right, create a branch, make the change, and do a pull request. I mean, it's a very good workflow. And we're going to tie that in, potentially, to an R10K kind of deployment, where it's completely a software-defined infrastructure and software-defined environments. I've done some testing, and it works great. And also, we're looking into an automated testing deployment using RSpec, using server spec to some extent, definitely to kind of help make that Puppet code software development lifecycle a nice pipeline, and to make commits easy and safe to test. I'll put the takeaways. The other thing is we are testing Puppet 3.7 right now, which is very promising. So that's cool. And most of although some of the specific screenshots will change, the general idea that should still work perfectly in 3.7, and even a little bit better, because you can actually classes and parameters will inherit and allow overrides properly, which is a nice improvement. So as a kind of a wrap-up slide, the takeaways are Puppet Enterprise can allow you to be inclusive, it can allow you to be secure by default, and allow you to be highly federated, like I mentioned at the top of the presentation. And I think that it's really important to nurture your Puppet community, to have best practices, to have kind of a developer and user exchange of ideas. Because I think that, I've definitely seen the Puppet space change and update, and you can make it better. And I think that any single one of us could make something about Puppet better and make improvements. Because I've definitely seen it iterate upwards, even since I've been involved. And I highly recommend this use case, which is somewhat self-serving, but I think it is. I think it's a really useful way to replicate the role and profile model in the console in a way that makes it easy to use, that makes it more visible, and allows more people to make substantive changes, which is nice. Last slide, that's courtesy of my son, that's Puppet Man. Slide deck will be available. We actually, if you're curious, I only have one link on this whole slide, and that's it. That is a picture of our UT Puppet architecture, and of how, the details of how we actually make all this stuff work. Redacted as needed, and there's me. So I'm a little under time. Any questions? Going once? Going twice?
What's the size of the infrastructure?
About 500 nodes. Oh, he asked what the size of the infrastructure is, and we have about 500 nodes.
Can you join Federated?
Yes. Yes, we're working on it. We're looking very closely at Razor, so I really enjoyed that in that presentation. Most were virtual, so we're doing 10 days and so on. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you manage profile sprawl and organize things into kind of standards and those kind of concepts?
Well, the way that we use it, and I think that I make it deliberately kind of generic in the presentation, so that because everybody's a unique snowflake, and everybody has their own setups. We tend to fall out in kind of organizational groups. So like we have ITS systems, which is our kind of base group, which is all the things that our group manages. That's broken up into like managed by. That's further broken up into service and then service environment. We haven't had too much trouble with sprawl, since most of it's fairly top down. We're kind of working at operating kind of an OS level and then working up to the service level in the middle of it. So it hasn't really been a problem yet. But the nice thing is, with this setup, is that it's fairly flexible. Is that you could, you're applying the classes, the kind of the primitives, right? The classes and the variables, which we'll probably get away from. Honestly, it'll mostly be parameterized classes. But that class is whatever you make of it, right? And so potentially, I could see a service simply adding a class that itself was a profile module, and then just kind of using the best of both worlds. Is that most of our focus has been on making sure that your box has the base level stuff, and that you can add things onto that. And I think that's kind of, I suspect that's where you would get the sprawl, where you start getting, Apache 1, Apache 2, Apache 3. And there's a risk with that. Haven't run into that yet, but that would probably be the way that we'd have to, and I think that goes back to community too, is that how to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of use cases, that they know what's available so that they don't start reinventing the wheel. Make heavy use of Puppet Forge, which is awesome. But hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
It's Chris.